Hi, I'm Dave Liss, a DC-based consultant and journalist, your host for this series of podcasts, Wellness Musketeers, where we will be discussing a wide range of topics in the field of health, wellness, and physical fitness, with maybe a little bit of management thrown in as well. In this episode, we will discuss the importance of an annual health evaluation. But first things first, it is our great honor to have a guest panelist join us today, and that is Nadine Chapman from the World Bank Group. If you could start by giving us a brief rundown on your background and how you came to know fellow panelists, namely Aussie Mike and Dr. Kennedy.
Hi, it is an honor to be here, and my name, as you said, Dave, is Nadine, and I have worked at the World Bank for approximately 22 years, and my specialty and passion is conflict resolution, specifically mediation. But I've also worked in human resources and ethics and also their legal departments. So I have a fairly broad spectrum of experience in the employment arena. And I had the honor and privilege of working and meeting Aussie Mike and Dr. Kennedy while they were still employed at the World Bank. Aussie Mike was the director of the health center, and I was a regular member there. And I will tell you that health center saved my life, literally, and kept me sane, particularly in my early years working at the World Bank. And Dr. Kennedy was a highly esteemed doctor and physician and director of the health services at the World Bank. And I had the pleasure of being his patient and over the years developing a friendship, not only with him, but also with Aussie.
That's wonderful. And I'd like to go ahead and have our co-hosts introduce themselves. Dr. Kennedy?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Richard Kennedy. I'm an internist who has over 36 years of clinical experience, including the World Bank Clinical Services in private practice. I'm currently working in Washington, D.C. at MedStar as a primary care physician.
Okay, folks, Aussie Mike here. Mike James. I'm right now I'm a freelance writer and speaker, and I've got over 30 years of international experience managing leading corporate fitness centres with the World Bank over here in Washington, D.C., and in Australia with the Coles Myer Limited Group.
Hi, my name is Kettle Wieding, and I'm the boring guy here. I'm the economist with some 35 years of experience, most recently 24 years with the IMF. I have a keen interest in health and wellness. I was heavily involved in the fitness center at the fund, as well as health and wellness issues at the fund. I'm also interested in the intersection between wellness and society and how management and managerial issues as well.
Before we begin today's podcast, we have a question from a subscriber regarding our last podcast on blood pressure.
Yes, as one of our regular subscribers and listeners, Judith Maroy, asks, regarding our last podcast on blood pressure, what is your opinion about Bikram yoga and hot yoga when the studio temperature is set at 100 degrees Fahrenheit? Well, before throwing to Dr. Kennedy on this, I'd say a couple of things from an exercise perspective. There's always a little bit of concern when someone is going to exercise in 100 degrees temperatures, especially if you're not living in that sort of climate. Just as an example, most fitness centres are set at around about 68. It was even lower at the World Bank. We had it at 67 degrees because of the amount of people in the facility. So that's quite a bit of difference. So there's three major things I'd say about entering into a Bikram yoga class. First things first, if it's your first yoga class, I certainly wouldn't start with a 100-degree class. You should get used to the various poses and stretches for yoga in a normal temperature setting before going to a 100-degree class. That's pretty much common sense. Most important thing with exercising in that sort of temperature, though, is maintaining your body temperature. And we do that by perspiring, and when you can perspire more, you're going to be losing more liquid. So it's most important that you hydrate fully, both before a class, during a class, and that means taking a water bottle in there with you, and after the class. So staying well hydrated. And I think the third thing that's often forgotten it's not a contest. If you go into a class, it doesn't mean you have to stay the whole 40 to 45 minutes. I'd actually approach the instructor or the teacher, tell them it's your first class, and if you're not feeling great after 15, 20 minutes or even 10 minutes, you leave the class. You use a bit of common sense. If you're feeling lightheaded, you're feeling a little bit like you're feeling a bit dizzy and so forth, use your common sense and leave the class and you'll build up to it. So they're the basic three things in terms of exercise. But Dr. Kay, I'll throw it to you. What if someone has been diagnosed with high blood pressure? What's your advice for someone going into a Bikram yoga class where it's 100 degrees?
Mike, thank you for the question. I actually think it's really important, as you said, that first of all, know your own body. And if you've never done a yoga class, this should not be your first one. But more importantly, if you have blood pressure, before you entertain doing, and I'd say this for any new exercise, you need to talk with your doctor first. You need to know, under normal circumstances, what is your blood pressure? Because if you're someone who has really high blood pressure, you probably don't want to go into a 100-degree environment because of the downside complications that can result. And the same reason, if you are not hydrated, and why taking fluids before, during, and after is really important. You should do that all the time, with and not just with Bikram yoga, but with any exercise activity, because you lose water through all your muscle activity that you're doing with whatever exercise you're doing, but also with your breathing, with your perspiration, etc. So you can lose quite a bit of fluid pretty quickly, and the higher the temperatures, the quicker you're going to lose fluid. And again, probably the most important thing Mike said is, you don't feel well, you need to excuse yourself. This is not a competition. This is supposed to be an exercise so that you can get better with time.
Thank you, Judith, for the question.
Dr. Kennedy, why should we have an annual health evaluation?
Well, in general, we should have an annual health examination so that you know what your general health issues are. And the importance of it is that during the evaluation, there are several things that get determined. You find out what's going on within the family history. You find out what your general wellness is. And then we always check people's height, weight, blood pressure. We do general labs that will screen for blood sugar, for kidney function, liver function, anemia, cholesterol. And all of those things give us some guidance as to what the individual's general health is. And from there, you can determine a schedule that would be appropriate for that individual going forward as to how often they should have a general checkup. And a lot of this is going to be based on age, race, sex. And we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Okay, thank you very much. I heard a lot of people saying, I don't really need to go for a health evaluation because I feel good. Is that a good attitude?
No. I think the problem is, I think probably the most important thing to take away from what I'm about to say is that there are a lot of people who feel good who a year from now will not be with us. And that's because there are many chronic diseases that don't necessarily make you feel bad while they're damaging your body. And the only way that you're going to know sometimes is to do regular screenings. And much of this is also tied to what's going on within your family history. Why it's important to know what mom and dad, what health issues they may have had, because you carry half their genes. And so if you get some of their genes, and we tie this a lot to cancers, but you could say the same thing about blood pressure. You could say the same thing about diabetes. So it's really important to know. other than to make a guess. You'll get lucky sometimes, and everybody who feels good really is good, but every now and then someone isn't, and a simple intervention could have been had if they had just had a checkup.
So, Dr. K, who should get an annual health evaluation?
Everybody should, after the age of 18, should at least have a general checkup. And in many ways, going into college, you have to have certain things done, but it's not mandatory for you to have a general checkup. I'm going to divide this between people 18 to 49 and those over 50. Because those over 50, one, just because we live longer on the planet, there's a greater chance we're going to have more recurring problems. We're going to have, as they say, as we get old chronologically, things that were working really well at 18 don't work so well at 40, 50, 60, and onwards. But the only way you're going to know is to do those general checkups. So if you're under the age of 50, the recommendation typically is if you're generally healthy, meaning you don't have any chronic diseases such as diabetes, blood pressure, autoimmune disorders like thyroid, things like that, you could get away with doing a general checkup every 3 years, assuming all of the parameters that we check are normal. After 50, normally we want to do it annually. Now, the one caveat to all of that is most health insurers will pay for a general health assessment once a year. And that will entail checking for blood pressure, checking cholesterol levels, blood sugar, kidney, thyroid, etc. And as you get older, you start doing screenings for mammogram, you start doing screenings for colon cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, etc.
So when we have an annual physical evaluation, we get screens of information. For the male, and the gene will address female, of course, what's the key indicators we should really be looking at with amongst all the information we get from annual health?
But you always want to know for men, because prostate cancer is still the most common cancer in men. And yes, they don't completely recommend that it be done and screened all the time. But if it's in your family history, there's a greater chance that one will develop it. So one should always be screened for that. And we typically start at 50. Some people in the American Urologic Association, the American Cancer Society, sometimes suggest that you can start screening that as early as 45. Same thing with colon cancer. And this recently happened over the last 10 to 15 years that we found that where more and more individuals were developing colon cancer before the age of 50. And that used to be the initial age we started screening people for colon cancer. But now it's dropped to 45 because of the incidence of colon cancer in younger people. And one of the examples was the actor Chadwick Boseman, who died at the age of 43 with colon cancer, was diagnosed at 39, probably had the cancer for 4 or 5 years before that. And so if he had gotten screened earlier, they may have been able to catch it at an early stage where it was more localized, rather than at the time that he had it, it was more likely a disseminated or metastasized cancer. So it's important to do that. And men tend to have more colon cancer than women. Not by much, but it definitely does happen. And the colonoscopy can save lives.
What about high blood pressure, cholesterol, things like that, Dr. K?
That's very important as well. Blood pressure tends to run in families. Diabetes tends to run in families. If a direct descendant had it, there's a greater chance that gene has been passed on. And the earlier one person has it, the greater the chance it's going to be expressed in the next generation. So you always want to screen for blood pressure. Blood pressure, as we talked about in the previous podcast, is a silent killer. You may not have any symptoms until you have that stroke or until you have that kidney to fail or have a heart attack. So it's always good to screen for those things because many times there are no symptoms at all.
Dr. Kennedy, thank you very much. You had talked about some of the key indicators for men. I'm curious if you could share with us what are the key indicators that women should look at when having their annual health evaluation?
For most women of 40 and over who have not had a family member who's had breast cancer should start screening with a mammogram at the age of 40. And depending on the results, if it's a completely normal exam, they may recommend coming back in a year. They may recommend coming back in 2 years. It depends on the result as well as the individual's age. Women should also be getting cervical cancer screening, and they do that most of the time when they're going to see the gynecologist because of the incidence of cervical cancer. As women get older, the incidence of uterine cancer increases. But the same thing for women, screening for blood pressure as they age, it goes up. The same thing for diabetes. And we talk about obesity as a disease. It tends to make almost everything else worse. Just because that extra fat, because it's not good fat, tends to make the body have to work harder throughout. So those screenings need to be done. Diabetes as well. And this, again, these are conditions that can be managed because many people who develop these symptoms don't have any symptoms at the time they're diagnosed. The majority of diabetics as adults pretty much don't have any symptoms. We used to say everyone who urinated a lot or was excessively thirsty and losing weight was diabetic, but we see today that people have none of those symptoms and have significant.
What about other types of exams such as dental exam, eye exam, skin exam? How often should they be done?
I'd say a dental exam probably should be done at least once a year, and that could go on indefinitely. You probably should start in your 25 and upwards for sure. The eye exam will be based on what the result is because the two incidences, as we age, again, as we get past the age of 50, most people's vision changes. So a lot of people found out who had perfect vision that up until they were 40, all of a sudden started to need reading glasses or to get closer to the screen to see everything. And that's just a natural change in the shape of the lens of the eye. Eye pressure, which we call glaucoma, which is high pressures in the eye. The only way you're going to know about that is to actually have your eyes checked and the pressures checked, because this is not like blood pressure in the rest of the body. You won't know until all of a sudden you can't see. Wow. And that could take 10, 20 years for that to happen. Skin exams, again, particularly if it runs in the family, particularly that the lighter your pigment, the greater the of skin cancer. And the dermatologist will talk to you about wearing sunscreens, and I would tell people, irrespective of skin pigment, they should, if they're out in the sun more than 20, 30 minutes, they should be wearing a sunscreen at least SPF 30 or higher. And Aussie Mike could teach us about this as Australia has taught the world about skin cancer, because for the longest time, it was the highest incidence of skin cancer in the world.
Wow.
And now it's the least.
When should we schedule an annual physical? Are there any particular times of year, times of day?
No. Maybe it's better to do it time of day, because typically you're also doing blood work, and much of the blood work, you require the person to fast for 8 hours. So it's, for some people, not having anything in in the morning and then having your exam and blood work done at 4 p.m. It's not necessarily good. People get headaches, people get nauseated, people get upset, they get agitated at work, and it's not necessarily a good thing. I think the physical exam can be done at any time of the year. I tend to tell people since your birthday comes pretty much the same day of every year, use that as your guide. And if you do that, then you'll tend not to forget when to have your checkup.
Who should I go and see if I feel some issues with my heart? Should I just not go straight to the cardiologist? And if I fear there might be cancer, I go to see someone who's specialist in cancer. Do you have any instructions or recommendations about how we should go about in navigating the landscape of doctors?
In one way, it makes it, and I readily admit my bias as a primary care doctor. I think it should go through the primary care more because they have the skill set to determine if the person has, if they think there's something wrong with their heart. Sometimes just by asking the correct questions and doing some initial screenings, you can determine that it's really not the heart that the person's talking about, it's their stomach. And that it may be better suited to see the gastroenterologist. It's not to say that you can't go to the specialist, and depending on your insurance plan, some of them allow you to pretty much go with whomever you want, but many other plans basically almost insist you go through the primary care doctor. And that helps to keep care coordinated and together so that everybody knows, because what will happen is if you go to the specialist and they want you to come back for a follow-up, but you start to feel better, it may be okay that you don't go back, but it might actually be an indication that you needed to go see someone else about something else related to that. So it makes better sense to have a coordinated care where you have one provider who can sort of funnel and bring everybody together.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy. I have a gender-related question. If a woman has her annual gynecological exam, is it a requirement, or do you recommend that they still have their annual physical?
The short answer is yes. And the reason being is because the gynecologist is only going to focus on the GYN exam, the gynecological exam, and maybe the breast. Occasionally, if the patient mentions, gee, my neck is swollen, they might say, oh, gee, that looks like your thyroid, so let me, in addition to doing your complete blood counts and your hormones, maybe I'll check your thyroid, but they might not. If you're generally healthy, the younger you are, the more likely it is for you to get away with just going to the gynecologist if you're generally healthy. Because you go to the gynecologist, they're going to check your blood pressure. They're going to check your heart rate. They're going to check your weight. If any of those are abnormal, they're going to send you to a primary care doctor anyway. So it's better to have that as necessary. But if absolutely have to, but I recommend it just for continuity of care. Plus, many primary care doctors can do the pap smear and the GYN exam and the breast exam just like the gynecologist.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy. And I have a follow-up question. Are there any diseases in women that are more likely to occur after the age of 40?
Yes. Diabetes, heart disease, and particularly, and if you extend that to 50, the incidence of heart disease goes up, the incidence of blood pressure, the incidence of diabetes. And one of the interesting things is once women go through menopause, they typically are at greater risk of heart disease than prior to being in menopause. And the belief was always that estrogen that women had in abundance going through their natural menstrual cycle was protective for the heart. And we know this because there are a lot of women who, when you check their cholesterols, typically they may have elevated cholesterols, but they always have a lot of the HDL or the good cholesterol, which we believe is protective against the heart and fighting off the bad cholesterol or the LDL. And when we look backwards, that heart disease is number one in men until you get to around menopause. And menopause can start as early as 35 in women and as late as 60. And if you add to it people who might smoke, you add to it people who might drink, you can accelerate that process. So I think the diabetes, blood pressure, stroke, cancer, all of those things tend to occur at older ages.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy. And I have a question regarding culture and gender and race. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how culture, race, and gender, what is the intersection as it relates to health and annual visits?
The simple answer, and it's a loaded one, but the simple answer is that there's always been health disparities in this country with regard to health, and that people of color tend to not trust the healthcare system, will avoid the healthcare system till they can't avoid it anymore because they're having symptoms. And because of that, they show up within the healthcare system with more advanced disease. So the breast cancer in women of color tends to be more aggressive and more advanced in women of color than African American and Hispanic women. Same thing, there are more men and women of color who have advanced end-stage high blood pressure complications, i.e. kidney failure, i.e. strokes, i.e. aneurysms. And part of this is when people don't go to healthcare systems or don't have access, because these people, there are more of them who are uninsured, can't afford or if they get to the doctor, can't afford the medications because of the expense. So because many chronic diseases are asymptomatic for such a long time, people just live with them until they can't anymore. And then it creates a burden on the entire healthcare system. This is a difficult topic. It's something that we're all constantly working on. I don't think there's a simple solution other than trying some component of a national health system, which doesn't look like it's going to happen in this country anytime.
So we've been through a period that's been quite difficult for mental health for quite a lot of people. Is there anything such as a mental health evaluation?
Yes. Every time a person comes in for a general wellness exam, part of that is a questionnaire of about 6 to 7 questions that evaluates whether a person might be anxious, whether a person might be depressed. And from that determines whether they need further direction. Do they need to see a mental health practitioner? Do they need to be put on medications because they're depressed or they're anxious? And as part of the general wellness exam, you always ask the questions, and they're simple, open-ended questions. How are you feeling? How are things? Is life good? Are you happy? Are you sad? All of these things are simple ways to get an assessment of a person's basic mental health. And then based on their questions, determine if you need to send them to see the neurologist, to see the psychiatrist or the social worker or the psychologist. So those exams are pretty much every time you go, you should at least hear and get those questions asked. Or if the person's feeling a certain way, they should state it when they're in the visit, that I don't feel well, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm not eating as well, or I'm eating too much, different things like that.
Dr. Kate, referring back to the skin cancer again, I just thought it would be interesting. When you mentioned about in Australia, they had a very effective public relations campaign. It was called Slip, Slop and Slap. Slip on a shirt, slop on some sunscreen, and slap on a hat. And it had very marked effects on the incidence of so skin cancer. So it's a really important point to note.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It saved hundreds of lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that my family runs very much. But in my experience also, Dr. Kane, I may have even been guilty of it myself. These type A personalities will delay an annual health evaluation because we want to look good for the doctor. We want to lose a few pounds. We want to put a bit of muscle on or whatever else. What's your advice to those people who, delay for those sort of, say, cosmetic reasons?
It's okay to delay as long as you're healthy beforehand.
Right.
Which basically means you need to have known what you were last year. It's sort of like, I use the example of the person who's a diabetic, who knows they got to come in and get their blood work done to check and see. Now they know they've been eating everything, pies, cakes, whereas this is probably the one time I'll say people probably shouldn't have their general physicals in this country October 31st to January 31st.
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely.
Partly because people are going to, without question, are going to enjoy the holidays. And much of that means eating everything and anything in excess.
Yeah.
And drinking everything in excess that you would not normally do. So I wouldn't tell you to, so I tell people, have the physical, but don't do the blood work. Because you're only going to be disappointed, and you don't want to get your interventions based on that one setting. You want to get it when the person is more reasonable and is more in their everyday lifestyle of eating a more healthy diet. They're back to exercising regularly. They're drinking less alcohol. They're smoking less of all those other things. Then I would do that. But I don't think you should avoid it, because particularly men, because if we avoid it, that might extend into 2 to 3 years.
Yes, true.
We're notorious, if it doesn't hurt, I'll get to it.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of people who don't get a chance to get to it again.
Thanks, Dr. Kane. Interesting.
Welcome.
Dr. Kennedy, you have shared a few reasons why people choose not to have physical examinations. We heard from you there are cultural reasons, and also we heard from Ozzy Mike that the desire to have a six-pack or to look well could also be a deterrent from people coming to see you or to have their annual exam. Can you share with us any other reasons why people choose not to have physical examinations or seek medical care?
Fear, in that you have a family member or a friend or a colleague who you found out they had cancer, or you found out that they have diabetes, and you've done some of the same things that they've done over the time period that you've known them. And they, just in common discussion, you hear, oh, boy, I used to love drinking that coffee with that amount, with the 3 tablespoons of sugar. I've cut out 1 of the tablespoons. I cannot do without the other 2. And you then start doing what many people do, Dr. Google or WebMD, and you go and read about a particular concern you have. Once you read about it, it's going to give you the minor and the major and everything in between. And human nature is such that when you finish reading it, you have the worst case scenario. that you just finished reading about. Therefore, you don't want to know. And every time you think about it, I've had people make it and cancel 3-4 appointments in a 6-month period just because they're afraid of what I might say or what I might confirm. Or because you have friends who tell you that Johnny had the same thing and he had a stroke 6 months later. If I were you, I really would pay attention to that. So then you try to fix it yourself, but you're not really clear. You don't really know. And sometimes we can dispel a lot of the anxiety by giving you the facts. And fear is probably one of the bigger things. The other is I don't trust the healthcare system. I don't think the healthcare system can help me. And use it as an example, I have a patient who has had high blood pressure for 5 years and refused to take any medicine. And she said her faith will get her through. And every year we go through this, we keep saying, you're really running a risk, you're really running a risk. Then all of a sudden she started having nosebleeds, spontaneous nosebleeds, where she would bleed from the nose for an hour. She goes to the emergency room and what they do is they pack the nose to stop the bleeding and stuff. Then they go in and they eventually burn the blood vessel. And they say, but your blood pressure is so high, you got to take something. No, I got this. I'm going to pray about it. I'm going to be good. That young woman who was 38 years old now basically can't speak because she had a stroke. Now that's an extreme thing, but it happens. That were things that that the health system can do things to slow things down and to protect. There are lots of people who don't go to the doctor because they don't believe in prescription, but everybody. And medicines are not for everybody, but lifestyle is something everyone can do. Everyone can exercise. Everyone can watch what they eat and how they eat. Everyone can understand and know what their family risks are because they know what runs in the family. All of those things allow you to be proactive and take charge of what's happening.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy. And speaking of fear, I'm curious whether COVID, in your view, has impacted or gotten in the way of people getting regular medical care and or physical exams.
Yes, it has. It slowed the process. Partly first because we were in a shutdown for a year and a half. So basically, you weren't really seeing anyone face to face. Virtual or telemedicine came into play, and it's now here to stay. So you could get some guidance that way, but it's nothing like being face-to-face with people because it's amazing what body language, facial expressions can do. It did slow down getting general physicals because we just didn't do them because we were so overburdened with so many people getting COVID and being hospitalized and many of the providers who were caring for them in the urgent cares and the emergency rooms and the ICUs, they ended up getting COVID too. So then we were all pulled into the hospital system to care for them. So we weren't seeing our patients regularly. So we're slowly coming out of that now as we get closer to what we hope for is some semblance of a more normal return to the life we had pre-COVID. But the jury's still out. And with the physical exam, it's important. And yes, not everybody needs it every year, but everybody needs to go. And the problem is if you tell people to come every 3 years, they'll end up coming every 5 or 6, and because it's easier. And if nothing's bothering you, there's no reason to go. And that's why so many health plans have incentivized people to go and get checkups, and will reduced premiums because they went and had their blood pressure checked and their cholesterol done and their blood sugar done and their weight done, because they realize, and it's been borne out, that people who get regular checkups tend to be healthier than those who don't. And if you have a healthy workforce, work is able to be done. People are more productive. It costs companies a lot of money to care for the sick.
Can I pick up on that one? Because I'm actually from Europe. That is quite common that companies do have a company doctor or a doctor or a medical unit, and it's required that you go and see the doctor every year. What are the arguments really for the company to take an active stance in requiring or at least incentivizing staff to go and do a regular checkup?
To me, it makes perfect sense. A healthy workforce is a more effective workforce. The cost of healthcare goes down, then have more resources to do other things. And when you have an overburdened, unhealthy workforce, the cost to the company is not just the lost work days. It's not just that. It's the loss of business. It's the loss of revenue. It's the loss of resources. And you end up having to pay more people to come in and pick up the slack. So it makes sense to do it. And larger companies are starting to do it more, but it's hit or miss in the U.S. And I think in Europe it's easier because there are more national health systems in place, so they're tied to a lot of the employers. Here it's very different.
Dr. Kennedy, I was wondering, if, in your experience, are patients often afraid or reluctant to ask questions about subjects that they're embarrassed about?
Yes. It is interesting in different parts of the world. Doctors are considered close to God. And in that regard and I guess I saw it firsthand traveling for the bank, in that you would see patients who've been treated by a doctor for 10, 12 years and been given different medications for condition A, B, C, or D, and never once asked what it was for, because you don't question the doctor. In the U.S., it's a little bit different. People are used to questioning, and to the point that sometimes it's a little bit overboard, but it's good because I think if you ask questions and you get answers, you realize you're in a partnership with someone who's actually working with you. If you don't ask questions, and I'll say this, probably the best example, people who find out they have cancer, and they're in the process of going through seeing different specialists to determine how they're going to treat it. In the back of many people's heads, when they hear the word cancer, the next word they attach to it is death. And even with all the advances in cancer treatment, people still think that way, because cancer is still the number one killer across the Western United States. People are embarrassed to talk about sexual things. People are embarrassed to talk about their weight. There are people who are really overweight who will refuse to get on the scale. And you try to explain to them the reason we have you get on the scale, because we have this measure called the BMI that helps us assess your risk for other health issues. But because they don't want to know. Now, technically, if you're that obese, you already know that you're overweight. And so there should be some dialogue to how do we get out of this quagmire that I'm in? Is it because I have a particular health issue, or is it something that I'm stuck with? Very difficult things to answer. People are in the bank, and that was one of the things that was funny, is that I was amazed at how many people would come in initially in the early 90s and would never ask me any question. And I could literally tell them to turn around and jump up and down like a rabbit, and they'd have done it without question. Times are different now, but I always say the more Americanized people get, the more they question everything. And so in that regard, people know that because if you don't ask, you don't know, and then you have to make assumptions. And there are lots of people who will literally sit in the visit, and you ask them, and you ask at the end, are there any more questions? Did you understand everything I said? And they'll say yes, and they'll literally walk out the door, and if they're with someone in the elevator, they'll tell you, I had no idea what this went on. But it happens because they're afraid to ask. So I've always thought my job is to make it simple. Talk in a language they can understand. It's no different than why it's frustrating if I'm in a room with an attorney and they talk all their legal jargon, it sounds great, but I may not understand half of what they said unless they try to break it down. And I'll ask them to do that. But not everybody's like that. More people now than in the past, but we still have a long ways to go.
We appreciate you joining us for this recording, Nadine.
Just before you close off, can I just say one thing? A friend of mine from over 50 years contacted me. He'd listened to our podcast, and he was very appreciative because he'd had a heart attack in his mid-50s. And he was very appreciative with the advice Dr. Kennedy gave on blood pressure, and it's really motivated him to monitor it more now. So I think if we can have at least that effect, that's worthwhile in itself. So that's my friend Tommy D in Australia. Known him since I was 12 years old. So, folks, keep listening, keep asking questions. Thanks, Dave. Over to you.
Oh.
And thank you, Nadine, for joining us.
Well,
and Dr. Kennedy, I guess as close to God as we get. No?
Oh, yeah, I can talk to you about the God complex in medicine.
well, tune in for that episode. And thank you for joining us for Wellness Musketeers. Tune in for upcoming episodes to learn from global health leaders to gain the tools to improve your health, work performance, and live a more balanced quality of life. Please subscribe, give us a 5-star review, share this recording with your family, friends, and colleagues, and give a contribution provided in our program notes to allow this podcast to grow. Please let us know what you need to learn to help you live your best life. Send your questions and ideas for future episodes to Dave Liss at davidmliss@gmail.com.